All right, guys. So we are live with Dr. Neil Shenvi. Is that how we pronounce that, Neil?
That's right.
All right, sounds good. So, by way of introduction, guys, I just want you to know if you followed the lectures that precede this particular supplement, Neil is joining us very graciously, I might add, to discuss critical theory. As I've talked about, earlier in the course, obviously I'm a lot more informal here, as you can tell, but I think this is going to be just as much an important conversation in regards to worldview. I think that Neil, Dr. Shenvi here, is going to try to make the argument that critical theory is not just a sort of side note or something that's tangential to the conversation, but that's actually front and center as it pertains to worldview. As you know, we've discussed pantheism, we've discussed postmodernism, which I'm going to see if that interacts really here. Postmodernism. We've discussed atheism and theism and other isms. But Neil is going to try to say that critical theory is at the top of the list, at least right now, as the time of this recording. Something that that people of the philosophical mindset, whether they be believer or non-believer, are going to have to engage and interact with. So having said that, Dr. Shenvi has his AB from Princeton. He did his PhD work at UC Berkeley. He's done postdoctoral work at both Yale and Duke. And right now he has decided to set aside some of those paths to tutor and homeschool his kids through the classical method of education, as well as with other parents in a co-op. So thanks, Neil, for joining our class today. I appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right. So when we start off, I think that most people are going to want to ask, why should anyone believe you at all when you discuss something like critical theory, especially if your PhD, which I forgot to mention, is not strictly speaking philosophy, but more in theoretical chemistry?
Yeah. So yeah, my PhD has nothing to do with what I'm currently studying in terms of critical theory. And I really got into this area by accident. So I began to be concerned by what I saw as a theological drift among a lot of Christians. I noticed that they became concerned with issues of social justice, which is fine. They cared about racism and sexism and poverty. And I thought, that's fine. But then I noticed that their views began to change with respect to other topics like gender and sexuality and all kinds of things, like the authority of the Bible. And some of them even became atheists. And I thought to myself, I don't understand the connection between saying I reject racism, which obviously you should, and I do. But how do you go from saying I reject racism to saying, well, Christianity is just one of many paths to God? That confused me. And so I don't know why exactly I did it. But I picked up a book called Race, Class, and Gender. It's a 500-page anthology of writings touching on diverse topics like gender studies, critical race theory, Marxism, all of these different topics. And as I read this anthology, I thought to myself, my goodness, it made sense suddenly. People were not just adopting a few new beliefs about politics, they were adopting a new worldview. And that new worldview was eroding their Christian worldview and leading them into some obvious tension with Christianity. So that's why I became concerned. And since that time, that was about a year and a half or 2 years ago. So I've been reading as much critical theory as I could get my hands on. I've read probably thousands of pages at this point of critical theory, and specifically critical theory. I don't want to say that it's being promoted by Christians, but a lot of Christians who are concerned with things like racial reconciliation and who are writing books on that subject are being influenced, I think, by critical theory and its underlying premises. And so, you don't have to, I wouldn't consider myself to be an expert by any means. Like, if you're an expert, you have a PhD in that topic. So I don't think I'm an expert in that sense, but I have done a lot of reading on these issues. I've read primary sources. I'm not relying on, Wikipedia. I can quote from the authors themselves and tell you what they say. And so I think if you think that things I'm saying are strange or unusual, that's fine. But so I'd encourage you just to read the authors yourselves. Yeah, but I'm trying to give you an overview of what they're saying.
All right, thanks, Neil. So what would you say then if someone's listening to all this and they're like, well, all this sounds like a bunch of jargon. What is critical theory?
Right. So I'm going to add one more thing. I actually have a good friend Patrick Sawyer, who's co-authored some articles with me, and he actually does have a PhD in cultural studies from the UNCG and teaches on social justice and these issues at UNCG as a professor there. And he really is guided my reading and also co-authored these articles with me. And so, I'm not an expert. I would say that he probably is in this field. And so it has really informed my thoughts a lot on this issue. So anyway, that's if that adds a little bit of credibility to what I'm saying, then sure, great. You can use that too. Yeah. So what is critical theory?
That's fine. Go ahead. I was just going to say, just my philosophy background, just because you don't have, and you know this as well, just from your apologetic type stuff, is just because you don't have necessarily the PhD in it. Hopefully, our class is not going to, immediately bomb a test in informal fallacies and then dish out the genetic fallacy or ad hominem circumstantial. So, as you know, guys, what's important is that Neil knows what he's talking about, not necessarily the letters after his name. So, all right, thanks, Neil. So go ahead. What is critical theory?
Yeah, so critical theory is a very broad ideology. It's like talking about postmodernism, right? There's not a Bible of postmodernism. There's not a Bible of critical theory that will give you the 10 commandments of critical theory. So it's a little bit amorphous, but I've identified what are some major premises of critical theory. And as I go through them, I can quote lots of primary sources sort of supporting these ideas. But as I go through them, I think you'll immediately begin to recognize this worldview or this ideology. So let me just give you the premises really fast and describe them. So premise one is that individual identity, who you are as an individual, is inseparable from your group identity. In particular, whether you're an oppressed person or an oppressor person. So there are oppressed groups and oppressor groups, and who you are as an individual is inextricable from what group you belong to. Here's a great quote from Peggy McIntosh. She popularized the phrase white privilege. So this is from a paper that she wrote on white privilege. She wrote, "My schooling gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor." So she was an oppressor, but she didn't know it. "I was taught, wrongly, to see myself as an individual whose moral state depended on her individual moral will." So there you see this emphasis on group identity, not on individual behavior. Here's Robin DiAngelo from her book White Fragility, published last year. She writes, "Individualism holds that we are unique and stand apart from others, even those within our social groups. Setting aside your sense of uniqueness is a critical skill that will allow you to see the big picture of the society in which we live. Individualism will not." So again, there's an emphasis on group identity, not on individual moral states or individual accountability, but it's part of a larger group. That's the first premise. Number two, oppressor groups subjugate oppressed groups through the exercise of hegemonic power. Hegemonic power. What's hegemonic power? Hegemonic power is when groups impose their values on culture, their expectations, their norms. So we think of oppression, the dictionary defines oppression in terms of prolonged, unjust, cruel treatment or control. But critical theorists don't define oppression in that way. Oppression to a critical theorist means that your group is defining the norms and values by which other groups are judged. So here's a good quote from, this one is from Margaret Anderson. "Power is typically equated with domination and control over people or things. Social institutions depend on this version of power to reproduce hierarchies of race, class, and gender." Here's another one from Essentially and DiAngelo again. "In any relationship between groups that define one another, men, women, able-bodied, disabled, young, old, the dominant group is the group that is valued more highly. Dominant groups set the norms by which the minoritized group is judged." So again, it's not about enslaving people physically. It's about setting the agenda, setting the ideology that governs society. That's called hegemonic power. So in this sense, groups like whites, men, heterosexuals, the rich, the educated, are all groups that are oppressor groups because they set the agenda. They dictate the norms by which other groups are judged. So that's a key premise there.
Right. So let me just interject very quickly.
Sure.
And I'm not going to try to offer any critique at this point, but I do just want to point out already I see within the first point that you say, the first kind of the axiom already, the first axiom that you laid out is that, I would want to say that this is, it almost sounds like postmodernism, just in a new outfit. It looks as if it's something just old school postmodern thought dressed up in a new tuxedo. Um, Also, in regards to the second point, which would suffer all the critiques of postmodernism, but then the second
Sure.
point, it seems like that uh, again, it's just heavily influenced by postmodernism as regarding to group identity, truth being determined by cultural relevancies, and so on and so forth. But I'll let you keep going. I just wanted to go ahead and make that remark.
No,
Just
that's a
offhand.
good interjection. And the key is, so some people refer to critical theory, their terms are used a lot, like Jordan Peterson calls it postmodern neo-Marxism.
All right.
People call
Okay.
it identity politics. People will call it intersectionality, or another one is cultural Marxism. I
Right.
don't like any of those terms. I think they're not ideal. I prefer just calling it critical theory, because critical theorists themselves will call it critical theory.
Mhm.
So just use the term that they use. But the key point, critical theory is not thoroughly postmodern. It's not. In a second. So they definitely absorb a lot of ideas of postmodernism with regard to truth. The idea that truth is a power play, as borrowed from Foucault, even Nietzsche, Derrida.
Right.
But here's a third premise. This is going to be completely modernist. So listen, premise number 3. Our fundamental moral duty is freeing groups from oppression. That is an absolute moral imperative. The one thing you ought to do, all people ought to do, is they ought to free groups from oppression. Now that is a moral absolute. So as you know, postmodernism would reject the idea of moral absolutes, whereas critical theory embraces them wholeheartedly. You ought to stand up for the oppressed. You ought to dismantle hegemonic power. You ought to defend the rights of the powerless. That is an absolute imperative. That's key to critical theory.
Okay, so good point, Neil. But how about this? Would it be really more that they actually recognize that, or is it that they're being radically inconsistent with their own view? Because, of course, as I know that you'll probably point out at some point in the discussion, that's going to end up being self defeating in some
Yes.
sense.
So they are being inconsistent. I would argue, because many of them also will be moral relativists.
Right.
But again, I wanted to emphasize that won't stop them. Whereas a postmodernist would just admit, yeah, that's right, there's no absolute moral truth. A critical theorist would not. They'll insist. They'll go to the wire, saying, yes, we absolutely should free oppressed groups. And so that's a big difference. Another big difference is this, as I'll talk about in a second. Postmodernism, if you had to sum up postmodernism in maybe one sentence, you'd say postmodernism is a rejection of all meta-narratives.
Sure.
Right? They're all equal. All meta-narratives are illusions. They're all made up. They're all equally valid or invalid. But critical theory embraces one single meta-narrative, right? The meta-narrative is oppressed groups are dominated by oppressor groups, and we ought to seek their liberation. It tells a story about reality. One story. Everyone's locked in the struggle for dominance. That's a meta-narrative. So
Right.
in postmodernism, you'd say all meta-narratives are equal, but critical theory has one absolute meta-narrative that it embraces. So again, there's both similarities and in contrast from postmodernism, understood broadly.
Okay, so you're saying they recognize that they don't take that to be a logical inconsistency. You're saying that they actually recognize it and make the claim, right?
Yeah. So I don't think
Okay.
they would. So it's like most. I don't think I've ever. Okay, let me back up. Critical theorists are not generally philosophers. I guess modern critical theorists are largely sociologists, gender studies, cultural studies. So they're applying these ideas to practical problems. They're not laying out a system of thought.
Okay.
So, and you'll see that in a second, because I'm going to point out, there are a lot of logical fallacies that are involved in critical theory. Just bad thinking.
All right.
But that's not a problem, because they're not philosophers. Again, this is today. This is modern critical theorists. The older critical theorists, like the Frankfurt School, 1930s, they were philosophers. Some of them were. But I think modern critical theory has been embraced more by sociology, all of the cultural studies departments, critical pedagogy, and these people are not rigorous analytic philosophers. If anything, they're more influenced by continental philosophy than analytic philosophy.
Right.
So you're not going to have this rigorous derivation of first principles.
Right, and I was going to make exactly that same point. I think this is another parallel where we see that this just naturally rides along with the postmodernistic views that have already infiltrated a lot of the humanities and social sciences and whatnot. This seems to be just a natural flow with this critical theory that it's going alongside postmodern thought in, say, English departments, sociology departments, and anthropology, all those sorts of things.
Right.
Makes
With
sense.
the difference that critical theorists would, rather than simply dismantling hegemonic narratives and dismantling truth claims and debunking them, like say Foucault would do, or Rorty,
Right.
they'll go farther and actually want to establish a new regime of truth based on this oppressor-oppressed framework, right? So they won't say, let's get rid of all meta-narratives. They'll say, no, let's just embrace this one.
Right. Well, that's where I would say it's kind of like the two rivers when they come to meet with one another, right? You've got this flow, and now there's just this big mess and mishmash, in these departments. Because again, I'll talk to some of these people at the secular institutions at which I teach, and it's like on one hand they're embracing this, right, this critical theory, and then and then 5 minutes later they're just saying straight up old school postmodern stuff, and it's just crashing into one another. So, but anyway, so go ahead and go with where you were going, Neil, with your points.
So those are sort of three big ones. Let me talk about some other ones. And again, you'll recognize the influence of postmodernism in these last three. So premise number 4 is lived experience is more important than objective evidence in understanding oppression.
Right.
So, and a big part of this is the idea that that oppressed groups have special access to truth that is unavailable to oppressor groups. So, for example, a person who is in oppressed group, say a person who is a person of color or a woman or a homosexual, will have special access to truths that you simply can't be aware of as a person from a dominant group. That special access gives them a privileged position of epistemologically. So they can see things that oppressor people can't see. So let me just talk. Here's a quote from Margaret Anderson and Patricia Collins in Race, Class, and Gender. This is when you hear this, you'll say, wow. But here's their quote. The idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking, one that we will challenge throughout this book, right? So they're challenging the idea that, you get to objectivity through reason and argument. They're saying no, and they replace that with lived experience. We need to include lived experience as a way to gain knowledge. And if you don't have experiences of oppression, then you have no knowledge, or at least not as good knowledge. Their knowledge is not complete. You have to defer to the opinion of oppressed groups. And in many ways, if an oppressed person from an oppressed group makes a claim about truth, they can fall back on, well, this is my lived experience. And if you deny that claim, then you're invalidating their lived experience. You're invalidating them as a person to say, well, what's the objective basis for your claim? What's the evidence for your claim? They'll say the evidence is my experience.
Right.
And so that's a big part of what we're seeing in so many realms these days, is that people appealing not to data, not to science even, but appealing to their lived experience.
All right, and this is exactly. I mean, you already made this observation, but I mean, this is just postmodernism, in a new tuxedo, all over again.
And then because of that, they have unique insight that a person who's simply a woman, or only a black person, or only a homosexual, they wouldn't understand. So intersectionality gives them, exponentially greater insight into oppression than anyone else. This is why we kind of have a hierarchy of oppression. So if you want to speak about an issue as a woman, that's great, but as a woman of color, that's even more important. As a lesbian woman of color, there's even more importance assigned to what you say, because you have, again, a greater insight into oppression than anyone else.
Right.
And so, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
So those are the basic 6 principles underlying modern critical theory. And I think that if you look around at our culture, you can see it kind of everywhere in terms of how we just naturally think, or many people think about just understanding reality.
Right. So if we were just to recapitulate just those 6 points, it would be something like a denial of reason and logic, obviously, is something like essentially just a Western type of construct, which again, that's going to fit nicely with a lot of postmodern thought, that you attain truth primarily through experience, specifically if you're an oppressed individual. Now, obviously that just raises the question: if you're not necessarily an oppressed individual, how would you know the truth at all? Right? How would you know the truth about anything? If you're not part of this, it almost makes it sound like if you're not part of an alleged oppressed group, then you just can't know the truth at all unless you're told what the truth is. But even then, you can't know really, because it has to be experiential, not necessarily. That would be, again, part of the self-defeating nature of the non-rationalistic process, even though that'd be the only way we could know, or I could know specifically. And then the others were, so the denial of rationalism in some sense, logic, just the reasoning process, the knowledge of truth through oppression via experience, and then what would be the others? What you would say, and maybe just a sentence or less.
The moral imperative of freeing groups from oppression.
Okay.
The moral imperative. The idea that oppressor groups hide their oppression under rationality.
Keep going. I'm turning this on.
One important point.
Go ahead, Neil. You can finish that point.
One important point is that what you're describing, like a denial of objective truth at all, is more a thoroughgoing postmodernism. Whereas critical theorists wouldn't necessarily go all the way. They wouldn't say that truth is totally unknowable. They wouldn't say that truth doesn't exist. What they would say is that, I think more commonly, well, truth does exist. They wouldn't deny that. But they would say that truth that people with privilege, their privilege blinds them to the truth. And not just any truth, like people that are privileged can know, say, scientific truths or mathematical truths. They can know those truths, but that will blind them to truths about their oppression. So their privilege blinds them to knowing that they're privileged. Their privilege blinds them to knowing truths about the ideology of the oppressor group. So they limit their denial of truth to certain regimes. Having to do with again, that's why it's different from postmodernism, a thoroughgoing postmodernism. Right,
sure. Again, but even that, though, if we wanted to go launch into some critique, even that, we would say, well, how would we ever know that, right? Like, how would I ever, as a part of the supposed oppressor group, how would I ever come to know that? Because surely, even if you just told me, I'm not really going to be able to know because I can't experience that, right? Which experience is just totally subjective.
There are actually two books I read recently. This gets into the idea that critical theory is becoming prominent among not just Christians, but evangelicals. I've read two books now by self-professing evangelical authors. Both of them compared the phrases getting woke, right? People get woke to existence of oppression and dominance. They both compare the process of getting woke to the healing to Nicodemus in the Gospel of John. Nicodemus comes to Jesus, and Jesus tells him he must be born again. They both compare the process of coming to this state of wokeness to Jesus healing you of your blindness, or that's in Bartimaeus' case. They both compare it to Jesus healing miracles. So you ask, well, how can you know that oppression exists? You can't know it through reason and evidence. You have to get woke. You have to be lit. And in their language, they're using this language of awakening. You have to have your blindness healed. And so, like you're saying, it's not through a rational argument. It's through an experience of God metaphorically healing your blindness, the blindness that was caused by you being part of a dominant group.
Right. So aside from those two, you kind of just go ahead and you touch on the next question. But it's where do you see this working itself out, Neil, and just in culture? And then what are some not just examples, but specific examples? You started to say even the evangelical church, obviously. But where do you see even more specifically that, if possible?
Sure. So in our culture, it is really everywhere. When you understand these premises, you can really quickly see how it's on the news. It's in movies, music. It's everywhere. Let me just pull out some really amazing quotes here. Recently, Google, for example, here's a funny one. Google, go to Twitter. Go to Twitter and search for the phrase "old white male" or "entitled white male." So if you do that, I know that is eye-opening. One really fascinating exchange was between Rosie O'Donnell from The View and Cher, the singer. So Cher wrote on Twitter. She posted on Twitter. She said, Biden Beto 2020, like heart emoji. Like, so she's supporting, she'd love to see Joe Biden and Beto O'Rourke run for the presidential and vice presidential candidates, in 2020. So she said that and people loved it. But Rosie O'Donnell wrote back, no Joe Biden. And so Cher says, well, what's wrong with Joe Biden? And here's Rosie O'Donnell's response: no more old white men. So it's not about Biden is an individual as a person. It's about the group to which he belongs. That's that oppressor group thing. It's not about his individual identity. It's about, well, he's an old white male, so he should not be in a position of power. They've had their chance. Now the future, Kristen Gillibrand, I think she's a senator, but she had a tweet that said the future is intersectional, right? That we need to this fact that it's great that we have people who are a part of oppressor groups. Now the funny thing is, oppressed groups. It's great there are more women and people of color in Congress. But now I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm saying, well, why? It doesn't matter what their policies are, right? It doesn't matter what they actually believe they want to do with the country. That what matters is their identity as a group, who they are. So you can see that all over the place. And then, okay, in terms of Christian, the church, one sort of there are lots of examples, and this is kind of what got me concerned about this topic. One example is that there was a recent statement on social justice in the gospel. So John MacArthur and a few other people put together and signed a statement about how social justice, they're worried about its encroachment on the gospel. But setting aside that statement, there was a response made to that statement by a number of people, including Union Theological Seminary. And they tweeted out a response statement. And in their first statement, they said, we deny that the Bible is infallible or inerrant. We deny it. Why? Because it contains both the inspired words of God and the sin of men, the prejudice of sinful men. Well, how do you know which is which? And they say biblical scholarship and critical theory can help us determine which messages are God's. So they are saying explicitly that critical theory is going to help us to differentiate between what in the Bible is God's inspired authoritative word and what is just the sinful ramblings of human beings. So they're setting up critical theory as the standard to judge between the two.
Right, which is unbelievably subjective in your interpretation of who gets to decide what is the rambling of the sinful man, right? But then even more, it seems like a large problem would be, and this is just a side note, we don't have to pursue this, but it just seems like even more that if it's impossible for the oppressor, right, the one who's in the position of power over and above anyone else, it's just impossible for him to know the truth, right?
About oppression.
Right, about oppression and whatnot. This just seems really weird for those that would want to call themselves Christians, because God would, by definition, be the ultimate oppressor, right?
Well, that's one of my criticisms. The critical theory sees power as inherently corrupting and inherently bad, right? You want to destroy hegemonic power. That's the whole But the Bible is what? Bible is just one giant, colossal, hegemonic discourse. God's telling us one set of standards, one set of moral norms, one set of expectations, one set of values, and that is it. And so the whole view that critical theory promotes, which is that power should be resisted, power should be overturned, we should invert power hierarchies, is completely antithetical to a Christian worldview. Here's another. So another way this shows up is that in critical theory, it's going to sound so crazy, but critical theorists will list a number of isms as forms of oppression. So things like racism, sexism, classism, these are forms of oppression. But they'll also, on the same level, include things like heterosexism, cisgender normativity, homophobia, transphobia. Those are all forms of oppression. They'll also add adultism. Adultism is the oppression of children by adults. They see children as an oppressed group because adults impose their norms and values on children. They exercise hegemonic power over their kids, right? So, and I saw numerous authors saying that children are oppressed, need to be liberated from their oppressor. So you think that sounds crazy, but there are many authors saying this.
Well, this goes back to this goes back to the example I remember seeing of the lady that protested the children being their diapers being changed because they couldn't even have consent in order to do something.
Right. Who are you to say that a dirty diaper is a bad thing? You're on a child. And yeah, you think about it. Anyway, so I'm just pointing out that they really do make hegemonic power their only lens. The only lens you see things in critical theory through is power. Who has power? How can it be subverted? How can it be overturned? That's the one framework they have for interpreting reality.
Right. So let me ask you this, good doctor. How you're a person that's of mixed ethnicity, right? Now, how would you be looked at, right? Again, there's all sorts of derogatory type terms that have been used in the past, but how would you be looked at, right? Or how would you answer the charge, rather, I should say, that you're simply just capitulating, right, to the oppressor groups of which you are up under yourself, right? That you're just essentially agreeing with your oppressors. How do you answer that type of charge?
Right. And so there are two things. One is that so I'm half Indian. And so, yes, I'm not white, but the problem is that critical theory in this way is very inconsistent. Well, not entirely. It's consistent in a very perverse way. If you agree with critical theory and you support and are in agreement with all of the claims of critical theorists, as a white male, for example, as a white male heterosexual, as long as you agree with critical theorists, they won't have a problem with you. They'll say, "Good, you are supporting the liberation of oppressed groups. You're on the right side of history. You're doing the right thing." So you can have a voice if you agree with their claims. However, if you disagree, that's the problem. If you disagree, if you say, "Actually, I don't really buy this whole oppressor-oppressed dichotomy," that's when you'll be accused of trying to preserve your power. So you're allowed to actually have a voice as an ally of oppressed groups. As a white person, as a male, as a heterosexual, as an educated person, that's fine. It's only when you disagree that critical theorists will bring in this claim that, you're just motivated by power. Now,
right. That seems to be very convenient, right? That seems to be super convenient.
Yes.
And why no Joe Biden then, right? Rosie O'Donnell's earlier remark, well, no Joe Biden. Well, why not? If he's already on board, what's the problem?
Well, maybe not on board enough. Remember, even Bernie Sanders was criticized for, again, not being enough. Always, basically, unless you're in full-throated agreement with the critical theorists, complete agreement,
right?
Then you're always going to be charged with not being a true ally. Your only way to really secure their allegiance is to completely defer to them on everything. But here's the problem. So let's say me. I'm biracial. I'm half white, half Indian. So I'm not white. So if I say, well, I don't agree with this worldview, what I get charged with? Well, they charge me with internalized oppression.
Right.
So I have internalized the norms and values of the dominant group, whether it's white people or rich people or men. So I'm charged with, and you'll see this with a lot of black conservatives too. People like Thomas Sowell will be charged with internalized oppression. They're only saying the things they're saying because they have been brainwashed or at least subconsciously influenced by white supremacy. So for me, I will get some platform because I can say, well, I'm not actually white, but they can still say, well, you're not really speaking from the experience of a person of color. Number one, because I'm not, I'm half Indian. I'm barely, in their view, I'm barely not white. I'm mostly white. But also because if I disagree with them, I'm showing that I am influenced by this white supremacist ideology. So it's unfalsifiable. If a person from a dominant group disagrees with them, then obviously they're just motivated by their power. A person from an oppressed group disagrees with them, well, they're internalizing their oppression. So they can discount any criticism at all of their position. So would I be charged with being somehow, unfortunately, what I would say is if you can get people to think through these issues rationally, what I would say at the outset is, well, I don't accept the very notion that we can evaluate statements of truth based on who says them. So I would say at the outset, well, I don't accept the idea that as a blank, as a male, as a white person, as a black person, as a half Indian, I don't believe I have a privileged place of knowing the truth. I reject that idea at the outset. So you have to convince me that I ought to accept your epistemology, which I deny. So that's where I would start there and say, I would say as a Christian, I think that truth can be known, for example, through Scripture.
Sure. And
whether or not we're part of an oppressor group and oppressed group. And so if you deny that, you say, well, as an oppressor, you can't know the truth. I'd say, well, wait a minute, then you're undercutting the very basis for Christianity, or at least the idea of reforming our beliefs to Scripture. As soon as you say, well, you can't know about oppression based because you are a man, or you are a heterosexual, you're a white person, well, then you're saying the Bible cannot speak to us, that God's incapable of giving us awareness of oppression through the Bible. That's a big claim there. What's your evidence to support it?
Sure. Now, what would you look at, Neil? I'm sure you've thought about this before, and as you kind of teased the ramifications of this view out. What happens? Because right now, I mean, it could be said roughly that the country being as divided as it is, that there are obviously a large amount of people that buy into, if not this in its full blown aspect, at least in some large measure. Now, let's say that this belief that's held by at least one particular side of the political spectrum, let's say they come into power, right?
Yeah.
And they hold this belief. Well, then by definition, that would make me oppressed, right? So how do they answer something like that immediately seems to backfire?
Right. Yeah. That's fascinating. So what they would say, and this is interesting because what they would say, what the critical theorists would say is, first of all, they would just, I think, for as long as possible, deny that they're actually in power. So, for example, so people take President Obama. When Obama was elected, a lot of people were like, look, they're like, a black man is now the president of the United States. Like,
right.
How can we still say that black people are oppressed?
At least to the degree that they're saying.
Well, but here's the thing. Remember, Russ, this is the key part. The oppression is not about actual authority. I mean, he's the president right now, right? But remember, according to critical theory, oppression is about ideology. Right. So all of the ideology of, say, the patriarchy or white supremacy, the idea that whites being white is normal, white norms are expected, whites are more valuable than blacks. That's built into everything: our educational system, our criminal justice system, our media, our entertainment. It's all over the place. So simply having one black man as president is not going to change any of that. And actually, I agree with them in principle, that idea that, well, because Obama is president now, suddenly all those things have vanished. No, they're absolutely right. It's not enough to offset that ideology. However, I take issue with the idea that oppression should be defined as, in terms of ideology. I think oppression, again, biblically speaking, and according to the dictionary, is not some sort of ill-defined normativity of an ethnic group or a gender, whatever. So a parallel here would be the patriarchy.
Right.
Talked about patriarchy for decades. But let's say Clinton had been elected. If Clinton had been elected, it's not that a feminist would simply abandon the idea of the patriarchy. They would not, because they would still hold that all of our institutions, our structures, the nuclear family, the churches, our culture, our media would all still be patriarchal. So whether or not Hillary Clinton is president does not affect those institutions and those systems of thought.
Now let me offer a little pushback really quickly there, Neil, because what it seems to be, I think a priori that seems to make sense. Yeah, just because you have this one particular individual that doesn't fit the quote unquote norm, who rises to a position of power or a position of authority, that doesn't necessarily negate all of these other things, all of the other claims that we're making. However, I'm going to offer a little pushback there and say, well, wait a minute though. If it's as deeply ingrained as you're claiming, that not you obviously, but as the critical theorist is claiming, if it is in fact as deeply ingrained within the school system, within the educational models, within the the judicial systems, just all over the place. If it's as deeply ingrained as that in the political systems, then the very fact that this person has come into a position of authority shouldn't, by definition, even happen at all if it's as ingrained as you're saying that it is. Either
Right.
it's not as ingrained as you're saying that it is because this actually happened, or it's almost miraculous that something like this could repeatedly happen over and over and over and over, that we have people of different ethnicities and so on and so forth in positions of power. Because by definition, if you're right, this could never have happened. No one could have ever have gotten to this point.
So there'll be several responses, but I want to say one important point, Russ, is that remember, this is a worldview.
Right.
They're not going to be, they're not, so you're assuming that people are appealing to like empirical evidence for these views, but they're not. It's a worldview. It's fundamental. So I'm not making fun of it. I'm just saying that, like, so here's a good example. Feminists will claim that disparities in gender disparities are all the result of the patriarchy. So the reason that we have, only 10% of, they say that the gender wage gap, that women make 79 cents on the dollar for what a man makes, right, on average. And they'll say, see, that's the patriarchy, right? But that claim has been just debunked so many times because you're comparing apples and oranges, right?
Right,
so
right.
much that earnings gap, it's an earnings gap, depends on things like what field they go into,
Right, right.
how many hours they work, things like that are obviously going to affect how much money you make. But here's the thing. The idea that the patriarchy exists it's not based on the gender earnings gap. The gender earnings gap is being used to support this idea that's already there.
Right.
That's the difference. So
they are using empirical data when it's convenient to their point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's you're reversing. So they're not grounding their framework in empirical data. They're using empirical data when it's useful to support their position.
Right.
Now, again, let me make very clear. I do think that there is actual racism and discrimination that goes on widely in the U.S. And I have data to support that. So I can pull up papers on hiring discrimination, on the death penalty, application of death penalty. So I'm not denying the evidence. There is.
Sure.
I really make that clear. When I say things like, I don't think that oppression should be defined in terms of hegemonic power or discourses, I'm not denying that those discourses exist, that we do have elements of, a good example I always use is beauty. Think about how Christian parents have to work so hard to teach their children that beauty is more than just external, right?
Sure.
That women are not sex objects, that pornography is bad. Think about how Hollywood and Madison Avenue inculcate our kids with all these images from they're 2 years old, teaching them that women are just for sex, their beauty is all that matters. So that's hegemonic power. It exists. It's a real thing.
Sure.
And we have to fight against it. I'm just saying that I wouldn't say that's, one, it's not oppression as the Bible defines it. And number two, we have to be tethered to evidence. We shouldn't just adopt this framework as an ideology or as a worldview because it's going to have other implications. And the example I always give is critical theorists, again, they apply this critique not just to race, but to gender, to sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity. They see all of those things as forms of oppression. So if you're going to say, yes, we ought to overturn, say, an ideology of white supremacy, again, understood as whites being the norm, well, then will you also overturn heteronormativity, which is what critical theorists want you to do, which is overturning heterosexuality as a norm, as a normal thing, or cisgenderism, the idea that our gender and our sex correspond. Is that a norm too? Should we overturn that as a norm? So critical theorists wanted to overturn all those norms, whereas Christians should obviously be hesitant to. But if you're going to embrace this worldview, you have to be consistent here and embrace it holistically, not just when you like it.
Right.
So I think that's the big problem I see.
So if one of the things I see already, again, we don't have necessarily the time to go into deep critiques, but I'm already seeing just radical, not just inconsistencies, but radical inconsistencies in adopting or trying to at least maintain something like critical theory as a valid worldview. Now, having said that, how would you, what advice would you give to the quote unquote normal, everyday Joe Blow, right, who's trying to engage with this kind of ideology when he doesn't have any sort of formal or academic training, say in philosophy or critical thinking and whatnot? What would you say to the person who's trying to engage with this sort of stuff?
Well, you said critical thinking. I think you meant critical theory, right?
No, I meant actually like logic or just critical thinking, right?
Yeah, right. So that's a key bit is that we need to be committed to thinking critically. So number one, if you are drawn to critical theory, some of the things that we're describing, oppression and liberation, social justice, if you're drawn to those ideas, make sure you're thinking critically, meaning don't just accept what the experts tell you in terms of what you ought to believe about sex, gender, race, class, wealth, whatever it is. You can, I'm not saying ignore those things, but always hold those ideas up to scrutiny, and have your Bible open and say to yourself, what does the scripture say about these issues first, and then how do I evaluate these claims in light of scripture? I think too many people are embracing, like I said, embracing these ideologies without thinking critically about them and saying, hey, actually, this is inconsistent with what scripture teaches about sex, race, gender, class, etc. In terms of practical advice, what I would say is just don't use labels. Don't people start labeling critical theory, oh, it's Marxism, it's all, they start calling people names. Don't do that. Just try to always ask questions about the ideas. You don't have to label them. You don't have to label an idea as postmodernist or Marxist. Just say, well, why do you believe that? Ask Greg Koukle's questions, right? Greg Koukle's Tactics book.
I've got that in this course, actually.
Yeah, great. Yeah, ask when someone says something like, you should never challenge the claims of oppressed groups. Ask them, why do you think that? What makes you think that? What evidence do you have? Or with this, ask them questions like, well, what happens when two people from a oppressed group disagree? Right. A person X says one thing, a person X says person Y says the opposite thing. Which one is right? Can I challenge either of them?
Right. Or what if you take an individual from one particular culture that's oppressed in that culture, and then you plant, or not oppressed in that culture, and then you plant them in another culture where all of a sudden they're the minority. What happens with those sorts of? What happens with that?
But all of those questions are questions that, again, they don't get asked very much. Right. Unfortunately, you have to ask just basic questions about coherence. I think you're right that this worldview is radically incoherent. It's radically contradictory, and it relies in large part on people not asking hard, pointed questions, and if they do, dismissing them as being privileged. Right? If I say something like, "Well, wait a minute, how does your commitment to say never silencing oppressed voices, how does that apply when, say, a female conservative speaks out on abortion?"
Right.
And what they'll say is, how dare you ask that as a male trying to maintain control of women's bodies, right? Mm-hmm. They're relying on shutting me down and silencing those hard questions. And what I would say is be gentle and be charitable, but just don't play that game. Not insist, but just keep bringing that question up again. Well, wait a minute. I'm making an argument against the morality of abortion. What does my gender have to do with that? If I get my wife and have her state the same premises, is the argument now different? Is it wrong or right? It doesn't matter who I am as a person. What matters is whether my argument is true or false.
Right.
So again, just don't play that game when it comes to your identity.
Right. So again, it's just essentially what we're saying is you just stick to your guns in regards to logic, thinking critically, asking questions. Even when those are being denied, don't give up those tools because they're just invaluable. If you give that up, you're gone. So if we go back just to even your biblical example, where, if say the Christian is committed to this idea of critical theory, and they say, oh, well, this is exactly like the account where Jesus is speaking with Nicodemus, right?
Right.
And Jesus has to quote unquote, get Nicodemus woke. Well, all right, if we're in the position, again, critical thinking, if I'm in the position of Nicodemus, I could just say, well, wait a minute, Jesus, didn't you create everything? Aren't you a specific ethnicity right now? Then why should I listen to you? Like, are you not in control of the universe? So why should I even listen to you? See, and again, that just backfires in regards to critical theory itself if you're thinking that while you're reading that.
Right, or you could say that person says, well, you're just blind right now. You have to get woke. I say, well, how do you know that you're not blind and I am woke?
Right.
How do you know that you don't have to get unwoke? So, but it's just I think the real battle right now is being fought over epistemology. How do we know the truth?
Right.
Once you give into this epistemology that says your group identity is going to determine whether or not you know the truth, that's deadly, because that will completely remove a reason and argument and logic from the discussion. The other thing I'd say, though, is that people should be very sympathetic to people's concerns about things like racism, sexism, classism, poverty. I think part of the problem is that there are the people right now that oppose critical theory not all of them, but many of them are not sympathetic to racism, classism, sexism. They don't care. They just want to troll the libs. They want to own the liberals, right? That's a terrible way to approach this issue, because you're going to have people digging in and doubling down and saying, see, you're opposing me because you're a jerk.
Right.
Too often they're right. So maybe the most crucial of all is, while you want to speak the truth and say this is a terrible epistemology, the truth does not depend on our social location, depends on objective reality. You want to stick to your guns on that, but you also want to do that with grace and gentleness, and appreciate, there is real racism in the U.S. today, and people are suffering from it. And because of that, they're embracing this view that sympathizes with them. Right. So I think a lot of the battles is being to be fought over hearts, not just minds. We have to win both. Yeah. Right.
So when you concede, when you're willing to concede that there are aspects, obviously you and I would say you don't need critical theory for this, but when you can concede that, yes, there's obviously examples of racism. I'm not denying something as insane as that, right? I'm not denying at all that you may, in fact, have experienced it yourself. I think that when you're willing to concede just obvious points, that really takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of your interlocutor there, so to speak. They're at least trying to see that you're at least making the effort to identify with what they think is a genuine concern, right?
Right.
And it may be a genuine concern.
Yeah. I think that, like I said, that does disarm them. That makes them more open to see, if they're willing to see you as a friend, especially if they're a Christian. If they can see you as a potential friend and an ally who cares about them, they'll be more open to your critiques of what I think is a very insidious and dangerous worldview that really is undermining a lot of people's theological beliefs and true theological beliefs. They're being, I think, led down some very dangerous roads.
And I think one of the reasons this can be such a powerful aspect too is just because, regardless of whatever particular worldview you may hold to, and you may be hardened because of a particular worldview, right? It may be more difficult to make inroads with those that share different worldviews. But if something like Christianity is actually true, then we're all made and wired by God to act and to think in certain ways. And so we have that on our side, in the sense that if I can identify with this person as an individual that's made in the image of God, in the Imago Dei, well, then there's going to be some things, even if they deny them, they're still going to, that there's going to be some sort of existential impact there, because that's just how they are. That's just the way they're made. And if they see that I genuinely care about them, that I genuinely want to reach out to them, of course, it may take longer, right, depending on the individual and how hardened they are by their worldview. But that's on our side, right? Do you see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we've had all sorts of ups and downs. We've literally had a mechanized barking robotic dog, and we've got one really piled up right here. But I think that we've at least got some substantial stuff out of here, especially for those that may not necessarily they kind of pick up on some of the maxims. They hear some of the cliches. They're hearing some of the terminology and the verbiage and the phraseology that's being used. But they're like, well, what is this? I'm noticing when I watch these movies, or I'm noticing when I watch YouTube videos, and this mantra of old white men, or this, that, and the other. I'm picking up on these things. What is this? I think that hopefully this right here will help to put some boots on, tie together what they're experiencing and say, oh, okay, this is what this is. And now that they're able to identify that, hopefully interact with that a little more effectively.
Yeah, the one comment I always get on my talks, which are all available. If you Google my name, Neil Shenvi, you can find tons of talks and writings and book reviews that can help you understand this better, and lots of primary sources. But the feedback I always get from pretty much everybody is, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Right.
Once you understand critical theory and understand these ideological, the framework, it's everywhere. You cannot unsee it.
Right.
And I think that's so true. It happened for me, is that when I began to realize these ideas were all linked and find a fundamentally identical underlying ideology, everything suddenly made more sense.
So, I definitely agree with that. I think that's one of those, even if you necessarily haven't studied it, if you're one of those quote unquote discernment types of individuals, I think your radar's already been going off, for the past 5 or 6 years, if not longer, of this sort of thing. So hopefully at least we've got a name that you can tie along with it.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So Neil, do you have any concluding remarks before we kind of?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, I would just say that. And I think for Christians, the big lesson here is, is what Peter says, is to, be prepared to give a reason, but with gentleness and respect. That's a different context, but I think it applies here, is that we need to be able to warn people about critical theory, that it is, I think, false and dangerous, but that we should do so with gentleness and respect, really showing that we love them, showing that we're not just partisan hacks who just want people to vote a certain way. We care about their deepest fundamental commitments of their heart to Scripture and to Jesus. And so that's what I think we want to communicate, even when we're trying to show them this is a really bad idea.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Shenvi. We appreciate your time.
Welcome.
And guys, remember, you can look up his, you can Google his name, Neilshenvi. Google that. I'm sure that there's probably not too many.
Nope,
Dr. Neil Shenvi's. You'll probably be able to easily pick up some of his extra work and whatnot if you want to look into this further. As you've probably noticed, we could easily do another 3 hours just with the critiques in regards to this, but we don't have time. So thanks, Dr. Shenvi, for giving us this hour or so.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah. See you later.
All right. All right, guys. So what I want us to see here as well is just simply that, or as you're listening right now, I don't want us to give up our tools and logic and reason. If we give this up, then the game's over, right? Because I want to leave you with this thought, guys. Logic, reason, the ability to think critically does not belong to one specific demographic or group. It is not the Westerners. It is not the Easterners. It's not the white or the black or the Asian or any whatever the spectrum may be there. It's just a feature of reality that we all have access to. It's not mine. It's not yours. It's not his. It's not hers. It's not theirs. It's all of ours, right? It's like gravity in the sense that gravity belongs to no one. Gravity is there for any and all people to discover. All right. So the tools of reason and logic and thinking critically, these are features of reality that belong to all of us. So let's not give up utilizing these things in the service of